Welcome to TeleFox. Today we will be going through how to scan the main routers that you have set up in previous videos. So let's begin. And once again I would like to apologize because I know I've been delaying on a new video, and I would like to thank all the subscribers and watchers over the time that have been viewing the videos and enjoying the content. Now that I'm back from different business trips and different business projects, I'm able to focus on maybe a few more new videos here in the future. So let's begin. Alright, so the first step is to go to nmap.org/download. This will give you the capability to download NMAP, the program that we will be using to scan the main edge routers. So it's self-explanatory. You just download the link for your different system and then you follow the instructions. Once you have that installed, we can begin the project. As you can see, I have NMAP opened right here. This is the graphical user interface for NMAP. Alternatively, you could install the old version, which is completely terminal based. So you would enter in your commands here and then basically it'd be the same thing, but the GUI version is a little bit more user friendly. So I will leave the script and the command in the description, but this would be the script. And then you would have to focus on the target. So the target is going to be the main edge router. So we go ahead and scan that first. And I will come back with the results in about 5 minutes. Alternatively, you could scan the whole entire subnet by adding the CIDR notation. So for this subnet, I know it's based off the 255.255.2550. So we will use 24. But if you know your specific subnet, you would want to put that there as a CIDR notation. And then we could also add debug. So flag, one more dash, and then debug. And this will give you information about each part of the scan. As you can see, it just starts spitting out a bunch of information. So we'll be back once the results are final. And please note that the debugging flag will give so much more information so that way you could troubleshoot to find out if a common vulnerability was found, and if it can't yield too much information, the debug flag will actually provide a little bit more indicator as to what you should be looking for to secure that system. Now, please note also as well that this kind of knowledge and program is taught on the Security Plus certification. It is a CompTIA certification and definitely worth looking into. Let me go ahead and show you that certification online here. It prepares you to become a security expert that is vendor neutral and provides you information on how to secure all sorts of systems, network devices, and based on various compliance and governance laws. It also was created and contribute to the creation development was a Target, Netflix. It looks like a government, Johns Hopkins, which is a known hospital, and it is one of the requirements for DoD. So if a person is trying to get security clearance for a DoD job, this would be your starting point. It's definitely accredited and worth looking into. As you can see, it's a DoD 8570 compliance certification. So back to the scan. As you can see, it's putting out a bunch of information. It's scanning the whole entire subnet, and so we'll get back with the results in just a moment. Alright, so let's go through this line by line through the debugger information. So the first part is explaining what version of the library PCAP it's using and the NPCAP version, and it's going to scan for the top 1,000 ports used in most servers and systems on the internet and in networking. And so it's going to go ahead and give a time report that host groups have a minimum of 1 millisecond to reply, or about 100,000. So it gives detailed information about that. Wouldn't really want to have to read into these lines for a security perspective because it's really not going to give too much information. Next is the scripts. So as you can see in this part of the command, we had double flag script, so -- script. This is going to use vulnerability script, malware script, and version script. Vulnerability script looks for vulnerabilities. Malware looks for any malware on that device, and then version. So it's going to try to determine the version of services. So if it's running an Apache web server, it will try to determine the various versions that Apache web server is using. Also as well for like OS's determination of other things for that system. So as you can see, there was 155 scripts loaded for the scan, and it started doing the pre-scan. As you can see, it ran the scan through total virus, so it ran the actual device's information to find out if it had any viruses, which is related to this malware flag in the command. And then it starts reading back some information, so it has a DNS query. Not much information about that. It gives us the time when the scripts were initiated, and so that's about right. It's about 7 minutes ago when the scan started. Alright, and then it says for the total virus, it says the API key is required in order to use the script. See description. So you might have to see description here. Then it gives us a time breakdown. Like I said, not too much information. Then we get the DNS. So with the debug flag, we really could pinpoint what that device is using for its DNS. And as you can see in this network, it's using a few DNS servers. So you got 1111, that's a public DNS, and then you got Google's public DNS, another Google public DNS, and then it looks like maybe a router DNS and another router DNS. And then this next part is the scan of all the subnets, entire IP range of that subnet. So it goes through every single device, and as you can see, most devices, they're down or they're not responding. So that's good, and the way we have our edge router configured, it's going to one router, and we have, I do believe, 3 routers plugged into the main edge router. So essentially it couldn't pick up any of those devices, which is, from a security standpoint, pretty good. That means that the hackers or potential insider wouldn't be able to find those systems' IPs because they're not responding. So even if they try to do a network scan with NMAP, it wouldn't really yield back any information that's important for them to exploit the system. So as you can see, it scanned all the way through all devices on that subnet. Most of the devices were down, and then it scanned it for 50 hosts. It looks like it did find a device for this IP address, and I know which device that is. That's another edge router, and it looks like it's using packet capture filter. So essentially that device is blocking certain requests, and if we looked in the system log, we could probably see that the device was potentially scanned. And from a security standpoint, that's definitely good. So yeah, let's go ahead and go over here to the other device. This is device 10.0.0.24, another edge router, and it was a flagged as a packet capture filter. And as you can see, if we go over here, it's detecting the scans. So it's detecting the wind nuke, it's detecting the ping of death, all sorts of attacks, and these were definitely initiated from my scan. So as you can see, yeah, definitely all these system warnings from the firewall are detecting the ping of death attack, as well as the TCP no flag attack and win attack and a TCP fin attack. So this router is doing its job from a security perspective. It's definitely blocking anybody that would try to be scanning from a different subnet into this device. So that's good. That's basically what that means right here, is packet capture filter was caught by this device Ethernet 2. So that's good. That's good from a security standpoint. It looks like the edge router also had TCP ping packet back from port 443 and its try number variation of 0. Not much information. It also has a try number variation of 2 for that IP address as well. Alright, so next we look at the complete scan. It took about 14 seconds to scan 50 hosts. I don't know if that's completely accurate. And then it explains the packets that it was sent. So 27.35 packets were sent, and the accorded bytes. Right here, it's initiating a parallel DNS resolution of 1 host, so it only found 1 host. Then it's giving the reading of its type of connection. Here are the other 50 hosts that it tried to scan. It couldn't find anything, and there was only one device that it scanned. That was the main edge router. It discovered ports 443, 80, and 53 open. This is generally correct because the main router is running a DNS server, and that would be 53, so it's basically handing out all the internet requests, and that's how we would get to the internet, so that's good. And then it also has port 80 and 443 open, and that would make sense because this router does have a web server that allows you to access and manage it. So you manage it from either 443, which is the secured encrypt version, which you would always want to do when managing a router, or then you have the unencrypted version, which is port 80. And as you can see, didn't really find any vulnerabilities, but we'll continue to go through the scan. Alright, so as you can see, there is some vulnerabilities, unfortunately, with this system, and this unfortunately cannot be patched that I'm aware of as of now due to the lack of firmware support from the actual internet service provider. But what you would do, and all this stuff will be blacked out most likely for security's perspective and to keep my system safe, but essentially this device is shipped with a specific setting. Most of the settings cannot be changed or updated with a new firmware because they do not provide that support. Maybe in the future they will, but as of now that I know of and after my research, it cannot be done. The only way really to do it is to shell into the system using port 222 and then using a command line interface to update the firmware or to prevent those vulnerabilities. And like I said, once again, these will be most likely blacked out for security perspective, but it looks like it did find a vulnerability with a DNS mask due to the version, as well as a fingerprint string, some other stuff. And so what you would do from here, you would collect this report. Essentially, you would copy all this information, maybe most important information, and you would throw it into an Excel document. So say you're doing this for a report for your system administrator who had hired you to scan the entire network and find vulnerabilities, and then from there find solutions to those vulnerabilities. So you would collect that data, you would most likely paste it into a Word document, and then you would start to categorize all the IP addresses in an Excel document as well. So you would just document the IP. And then you would also give it a category or various port listings or vulnerabilities. So let's do select all, paste it into a Word document. And then from here you would want to research each vulnerability and patch that system according to the security policies for that business. Now, in some certain instances, you may find a vulnerability that does not pose a great threat, and the risk mitigation process cannot necessarily completely eliminate all vulnerabilities. Sometimes it's almost impossible to eliminate all vulnerabilities in a network and on a system, but utilizing the information from the scan, utilizing the actual links, such as to the CVEs, and then doing your research on how to patch the system would be the best way to start mitigating it. And we probably will show you, I probably may come back and show you a video on how to basically patch these systems. But essentially, from my standpoint, I did do a lot of extensive research for this device, and essentially it's the way it's shipped. There is no way, and because it's owned by the IPS, there's no way to actually update it unless I would basically install my own router firmware, which could potentially break and void the actual warranty for that device. Alright, so we're back at the network scan here, and what we want to do is find out if we could shell or telnet into the system. I will try to shell into the system. I actually will not try to telnet, because telnet is typically not suggested. It basically sends the password and username through clear text. But what we will do, I have PuTTY already installed. We will bring up PuTTY and see if we could shell into that system. So let's go ahead and enter in the IP address of that system. It's selected as shell, and then you go ahead and open. Now, according to how they have shell configured, it looks like it's filtered, so it might not even allow a response or connection with shell, but we will check that out right now. If we don't access the shell and router through the shell, then we can't actually configure or change really any of these vulnerabilities, as I'm going to show you. So as you can see, PuTTY fatal error, network error, connection timed out, which means that the server or the shell server port is not enabled for that device, so we cannot PuTTY into it, cannot do any kind of administrative changes, which would probably be needed if we wanted to update some of these things. Alright, so the DNS update, we could add a new flag to the script. So let's go ahead and do that now, since that's what it says to do. So we open up a new window, just click on scan, click on new window. We're going to go ahead and copy the current existing NMAP script and command. Go to the new window, paste it there. But this time we just want that IP address for that edge router. And then we are going to add script equals DNS host name and DNS update IP. So we do that by going double dash dash script dash args for arguments, and then DNS dash update dot host name. And then it would have to be a certain host name. Unfortunately, let me see, I don't think we have the host name here. Let me just do a NS lookup for that IP address, and we will find out if it does contain a host name. So it looks like it's just DNS Google. So let's see, I think it's dns.google.com. Go back over here, and then we want to do another flag, double dash dash script, and we will add, actually we do this, we add a comma here after the domain name, and then type in DNS update dash or .ip equals the IP address of that system. Alright, so now that we have that, we're going to go ahead and run that scan. It shouldn't be long, but we'll go ahead and let that get taken care of here. Okay, so the actual argument did not work, and the reason why is because I think we have to delete that, if I'm not to be mistaken. Go ahead and add that. Let's just do another script as well. Script space. Need to add the T, and then let's try to scan that one more time. Yeah, so unfortunately that will not allow it to use that script. Let me see. Yeah, it looks like that's not going to be usable. There is an example case, but we could go and skip over that for now. So let's focus on the CVEs that it found. I was not going to go through the process of looking at the CVEs, but might as well, so that way we could get a better understanding of how to pinpoint the main vulnerability found. So for this case scenario, the vulnerability found was for the DNS mask 2.78. This is the DNS server that's basically running on the main edge router that was shipped from the IPS, and unfortunately I do not have the power to update it because I don't have access to the shell. But as we can see, if we pull up this vulnerability, it's from Vulners. It has the CVE number. You could always look that up as well. And as you can see, there's a flaw with the DNS mask before any version of 2.83, and as we can see in the report, the current DNS mask version is 2.78, so I'm behind for this machine that I cannot change. We're behind about a couple versions. So it allows a buffer overflow vulnerability was discovered in DNS mask extract names for the DNS packets before validating them with the DNSSEC data. An attacker on the network, so essentially the attacker would need to be on the current subnet of 192.168.0.0/24, and that's essentially 255 different IP addresses on that subnet. So an attacker would have to be on that network, and they would have to create a valid DNS replies and could use this to cause an overflow with an arbitrary data and heap allocation of memory. And it could possibly execute code on the machine, so it could potentially overheat the memory, causing it to give some kind of executing code privileges. So then from there they could create maybe like a DNS backdoor, do some other things. The flaw is found in the RFC 1035.c, which is, I do believe that's what it's written in the extract underscore name function. So it's dealing with the code itself in this descriptive C script. It basically writes the data to memory, points the name, assuming to the max dname times 2 bytes are available in the buffer. However, in the code execution paths, it is possible to have extract name get passed onto an offset based buffer, thus reducing in practice the number of availability bytes that could be written to the buffer. The highest threat for this vulnerability is data confidentiality and integrity, as well as system availability. So it could definitely bring down the system because of that memory overheat. And essentially what that would do is an attack on the memory overheat could cause a DOS attack, or a causing the system to be non-responsive and not working. As you can see, we have the all score of 2.7, and then it has some other variables going on. So it gives you a list on this vulnerability information, the attack vector. So as you can see, it would be on the network. You can't be in a remote system. You would have to still be physically on the network to cause this vulnerability to happen. So essentially what that means is that we would need the hacker or the person to be either install malware on a system on our network or be a physical computer plugged into that network. And so for that case, you would want to make sure that you secure all your network ports. You would ensure that you don't allow any authorized visitors in the office or in that business environment to access the network unless they are completely screened. And then from there, you just want to make sure you keep up to date with your malware and make sure that none of your devices on that specific subnet was affected by malware. Because once again, the attacker, if they have command and control on malware on a device on your network, they're essentially on that subnet and network. Thus, they could execute the attack. So from a standpoint right now, it's not that critical, but still critical enough for me as a security expert to say that I would want to update to the newest version of 2.83. And like I said, unfortunately, I don't control this device. It was shipped from the manufacturer this way, from the internet service provider. So there's really nothing that I can do on my end to actually update the DNS mask version. Alright, so as you can see, there's another common vulnerability. It has a score of 8.3. And as you can see, there's a flaw in the DNS mask. It causes a heap-based buffer overload, basically loading too much data into memory, causing it to crash. The attacker would have to be on the network. They would have to forge DNS replies and basically use this flaw, same thing, to heap memory management segment and execute code on the machine, very similar to the other vulnerability. Both of them have two distinctive CVE numbers. So what we could do is look up how to update DNS mask to a newer version. So if you would be the security expert making sure that systems are not vulnerable, you would look up how to secure or update DNS mask version. And because this router is based on a Linux kernel, a Linux machine, you would have to do it once again either through a special terminal or special area of the program. I cannot push the updates myself, so there's really nothing that I can do. But yeah, as you can see, if you're on an Ubuntu system, you would use the following sudo apt upgrade, and then you would upgrade DNS mask version. And you could also use tarball to include sources only. So there definitely is a way to update it. We will go ahead and look at some other options to get that updated to the newest version. So in theory, we would be able to stop the DNS mask vulnerability if we had access to the shell. So essentially, we would shell into the system with SSH, we would enter in the IP address, and then from there we would be able to execute Linux commands that give us the capability to access the program, and then from there we would basically utilize the following script, which we could find somewhere here. And we would just basically do sudo apt upgrade, which essentially upgrades all the programs installed on that Linux system. And because this is a Linux-based router, based on a Linux kernel, that could be done. Now, there is other ways to configure the DNS mask, but we would have to have access to the shell. And unfortunately, this router, it is shipped with the shell port 22 closed, so there's literally no way to update it from a perspective from a network administrator standpoint. At this point, what you would do is basically purchase your own coax to Ethernet router and somehow circumvent the control of the IPS. Now, because this is directly from my internet service provider, there's not much we could do security-wise, but that's basically how you would do it. You would remote in with the shell option, and you would execute the following command: sudo apt upgrade. You could also look up the version of DNS mask after that's complete to make sure that it's 2.85 or above according to the vulnerability. So that's for that vulnerability. Essentially, this is going to be across the board for the rest of these. That's 7.1, 7.1 here, and 5. So if we pull up these links, most likely it's going to be the same variation. So yeah, as you can see, as long as the DNS mask is updated to 2.8.3, it would work and it would contain no vulnerabilities. And then from there, once you update the DNS mask program on that Linux system, you would rescan to verify there's no more common vulnerability exploits. So unfortunately, that is a big drawback. If you have equipment from a internet service provider and you don't have control over the network equipment, it's best to look into getting another router, or maybe even connecting another router that provides alternative DNS services that's a little bit more secure. So for my case scenario, I do have this router plugged into another router that provides main network traffic. It provides the firewall as well. So this router itself is not using really anything to provide DNS requests. So it's sort of eliminated through that process. But yeah, it's definitely due to the version of the DNS mask program that's installed on this Linux system. So that was for port 53, which is DNS port, handing out DNS names and translations to IPs. Next is port 80. So port 80, as you can see, it probably provides some information as to what kind of router it is. And as you can see, you could probably purchase various routers that are going to contain better controllability over that modem, because essentially this would be a device that's pre-made, and they custom tailor it so that way there's minimal control that the customer or the end user needs to configure. That does bring security risks and threats, but once again, you'd have to sort of figure out what's the most important for your network. Alright, so we look here. I don't see any vulnerabilities that I know of here for port 80, but let's go ahead and read through the context. It's telling us what version of HTTP it's using. Of course, it has no index or no follow. So robots are basically what Google is. Google basically has spiders and robots that go out onto the internet, and if a metadata says no index or no follow, that means that Google will not follow that web page. So from a security standpoint, this is actually good that this robots are not enabled in the metadata or in the tags of the HTML code, because it does prevent potential security risk. So it does have some XXSS protection, which is cross-scripting server-side attacks. And I'll go ahead and show you what that is right now. Alright, so the X-frame option is set to deny, which is good. As we can see, the X-frame option allows HP headers to indicate whether or not a browser could use frame, iframe, embed, subject, object. This basically prevents the site from clickjacking attacks by ensuring their content is not embedded into other sites. So from a security standpoint, the fact that X-frame options is set to deny is good. So far, so good. Alright, so for the cross-scripting, right here, it's cross-scripting site attacks, which can be loaded to detect and reflect cross-scripting attacks. So that's good that the XXSS protection is enabled. Next is the X content type options. This allows the device to prevent sniffing from MIME attacks. So this is basically what it would do, is sniff for top level attacks and documents, and it prevents that content from being provided. So that's a good security measure as well. We also have some other important information about the header grabbing. So header grabbing basically gives information about the type of HTML and HTTP request that it has. So it has information about the GET request, as well as the HTTP options and the RTSP request options. And it's basically the same thing, just going over the same perimeters, that they do have certain things set to frame, deny, the X-XSS protection, as well as the non-sniffing. So that's all good, basically the same settings across the board. It also looks like has a option for SIP, so that's pretty interesting that it has an option for a SIP information. Then some other things that I read, it couldn't find the DOM-based site scripting attack vulnerability. Couldn't find any other vulnerabilities with CSFR, so that's good. Enumeration, it looks like it needed to, it didn't enumerate anything of value. Then it also tried to scan the web development, and this said this web server is not supported for that, so that's good. All of this is appears to be clean. So next is the 443, that's HTTPS. This is encrypted, it's an open port, and as we can see, basically the same kind of security perimeters for that website. As for port 80, so it's as secure as possible for that web server, not much to say, other than it does have the proper security settings to prevent hijack clicking attacks and cross-site scripting attacks. And as we can see as well, the HTTP malware host, the host appears to be clean. So there is no malware for that device installed. Everything is clean. If you would see some kind of vulnerability here that says, hey, this host is infected with malware, and it would probably give us the signature of the malware as well. Then we research how to get that malware off of that machine. Alright, so it does have some encryption vulnerabilities. So as you can see, it's using an insecure Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and it gives us more information about the weak cipher here. Now, you could exploit this by looking up the vulnerability. It's definitely exploitable, and essentially it's not encrypting the data to the point where a potential hacker inside the network would be able to pick up and decrypt the traffic. And so what you would do is you would install a better key strength for that server. So once again, we wouldn't be able to do that on our end, but you would shell into the device and set the appropriate cipher for that device for the Linux system to a higher key length, as well as a better TLS Cipher Suite. One program that could definitely do that on a Windows system is NARCTAC, I do believe. So if we look at the ISO crypto for GUI or CLI, essentially this device allows you to encrypt your server with the best practice. Essentially, you would just download it, click on best practices, and then it would use the best ciphers possible to apply to your server. Then you would just restart your server. Because this is not a Windows-based server and we cannot access any components or configuration files, there's nothing really we could do. But if it was a Windows server, you would download this, install the ISO cryptor, and then launch it for best practice. And I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like in just a moment. So So as you can see, there's a little button right here that says set to best practice. It disables any insecure cipher vulnerabilities and then applies only the best practice ones using the industry standard. Very easy for Windows servers to be secured with the proper encryption. And then you just click on save, you apply, and then you restart the system. For a Linux system, it's a little bit different. We'd have to go into the configuration files, change the way they have their encryption set up, and that could be pretty convoluted. And once again, most likely you would use something like OpenSSL, and then you would install the appropriate cipher suites that are best practice industry standard. And once again, we wouldn't be able to change this device, but yeah, you would go into the configuration files and remove any ciphers that you don't want to use that pose a potential security risk. Alright, and then last but not least is this port 49152, and it looks like it's a UPnP port, which is plug and play port. Essentially, this is for plugging in an Xbox on a secured network. It picks up the configuration for that port for the Xbox and sends the live information to the Xbox Live servers. So let's go ahead and look at that vulnerability momentarily. Alright, so it usually is to do with the Linux kernel. It looks like for this vulnerability, the thing that we need to do is update the Linux kernel. So once again, this is something that we cannot do. What we would do is shell into the program and update the Linux kernel using a specific command. Usually it's fairly easy. I'll go ahead and pull up an example right now. So you would use this right here. So we would shell into the program and then we'd do sudo apt-get distribution upgrade. That's going to upgrade the distribution and the kernel of that system. So Linux will now have the kernel that's most updated and most secure. So that's how we would eliminate those vulnerabilities, and that's if we had access to the shell system to remote into the system. But unfortunately, like I said, this system's locked down, so you can't use port 22 to do any administrative work. And that's how you would secure a device that had potentially found some vulnerabilities during an NMAP scan. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and you have a good afternoon.